Two of 5 reasons not to harm your loved ones during quarantine. Hard to believe that we've done 22 of these already, and I think I might have lost count somewhere, so there might even be more. But today I wanted to start with some happy news, and that is yesterday was a very magical day for someone who we absolutely treasure in our office. And we would like to give a kudos and round of applause to the one and only Madison Skinner, who found out yesterday that she passed the bar. Madison will be getting sworn in the next couple of days as an attorney, and we're really, really excited for her to join our team. And I look forward to all of you meeting her. And so with that, I would also again remind you of the survival juice that I have found, and that is everyone should experience the enjoyment and pure pleasure of Trader Joe's crunchy cookie butter. I'm telling you, it is going to be the next thing you cannot find anywhere after the toilet paper because it is so good. And even my daughter, whose preference is all natural organic peanut butter, has now moved into my camp with the cookie butter. So, our own private jars now have a little cross contamination. But anyway, okay, so COVID update. We had, let's see, as of yesterday at 3 o'clock, there's 2,813 deaths in Michigan. It's up 113 from the day before. There are now 33,966 cases of COVID that have been diagnosed in Michigan. That's up 1,000 from yesterday. But the good news is if you that you can, if you were to look at the graph, and Governor Whitmer showed this in her press conference yesterday, of where we would be if we weren't staying at home. And it's just an incredible difference. So even though the numbers are still really high and really are increasing, we have dropped in number of cases to number 6 in the country, although we still remain in the top 3 or 4 with our number of deaths. And the other thing that she talked about yesterday is that on Friday she will extend the stay-at-home order. It will be a shorter term than a month. And she will talk about the phases of people returning to work. So that was all really encouraging. Other things that are kind of astounding on the numbers front are that 113,119 Michigan residents filed for unemployment last week. Think about that number. 4.4 million people filed in the country last week. Over the last 5 weeks, 26 million people have filed for unemployment. So as we rush in our minds to get back to work, to open the economy, who's going to work in all these places if so many of them are now unemployed? And that's kind of one of those questions that's out there that no one's really addressing, although I'm sure they've thought about it. It certainly was curious to me. Another thing that's going on is Detroit Edison and the Detroit Public Schools have teamed together to bridge the digital divide. When this all started with at-home education 6 weeks ago, one of the issues was, some families don't have internet, some families don't have computers or tablets or whatever. This partnership is going to ensure that every person has those items in order to be educated at home. We actually haven't talked about education in a few weeks. And again, Just a reminder, if you have a child with special needs, you need to be in contact with the person who leads the IEP team, and you need to have a distance learning provision in the IEP. If you don't ask for it, you don't get it, you can't enforce it. So, and if there are different things that your child has gone through during this at-home or distance learning period that need to be incorporated if they go back to brick and mortar, let's have those discussions now. Let's not be part of the big rush if they go back to school in a building. So just some tips there. If anyone needs help or suggestions or advocacy, my team and I can assist you in being creative and different possibilities to solve whatever challenges your child is having, either learning at home right now or in these discussions with schools. We are a bit of hoarders when it comes to those kinds of creative pathways and have a lot of ideas to share. So the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about is, yesterday we had that sad moment where we learned about Skylar, who was 5 years old and died of COVID-19, the daughter of two frontline workers, one a firefighter and one Detroit police officer. Today we learn of a 5-month-old daughter of a New York firefighter who died. And it just raises the question of how safe we are lifting these restrictions when we now are seeing kind of a pattern, because it's been more than a couple days where a child has died each day, of first responders dying. And is that a consideration? Is that in the equation? Is someone thinking about it? It's so incredibly sad that these parents are risking their lives every day to save others and their own children are dying. So I don't know, but certainly if you want to post your comments about that, I think it's another relevant piece of all of this, and in our getting back to normal that we need to consider. Also, I reported a few weeks ago about how the Bronx Zoo had one big cat, a tiger, who had been diagnosed with COVID-19. Sadly, as of yesterday, there are 8 big cats who have now been diagnosed at the Bronx Zoo with COVID-19. So certainly the pets, animals can't catch this. That was kind of propagated earlier on is not true. And, maybe it's something with big cats, maybe it's with all animals. Another thing we don't know. So those are just my COVID thoughts for the day. Now let's move on to our topic today, which is the anatomy of an investigation. Investigations look really different in every case, and there's a lot of different things that determine kind of what the normal investigation would look like. I think it's really important, first of all, to explain to you, and this is what is behind me, that depending on the agency that is doing the investigation, the goal will be different. If Protective Services is doing an investigation, the goal is the child's safety, keeping the child safe. What do we have to do to keep the child safe? And that's going to be their first step. It's important to keep in mind, if you are under investigation by Protective Services, that is their goal, because sometimes they're not super nice to parents. Sometimes they can be very adversarial and suspicious and acrimonious. And just remember that they don't necessarily know where they're walking into or what they're walking into. When they respond to a report, someone has suspicion that a child isn't safe. And they could be walking into, a crack house. They could be walking into a stash house. They could be walking into a lovely, colonial home with beautiful gardens and a picket fence, which could also still be a drug house. I mean, you don't know. They could be walking into a situation where people are intoxicated or children are harmed or injured. They could be walking into a place where there's, dishes piled up to the sink and there's feces on the wall. Or it could be a beautiful, well-maintained home that has, a refrigerator and beds and curtains. I mean, so they sometimes are suspicious and are untrusting of parents when they start the investigation because of that. They don't know what they're walking into. And sometimes they're walking into really, really scary, unfathomable situations. The police, on the other hand, their goal is to find and punish offenders. So their investigations, although sometimes can be parallel, are different. The police have more limitations on them as to how they conduct their investigations by our individual rights from the Constitution. They have to get a warrant to search our house. We have a right to remain silent if they want to interview us. It's all that stuff that you hear on TV. And so that investigation has to really be handled in a methodical way. They can't just barge in and ask a bunch of questions and take whatever they want. They have to actually have an idea what happened, have an idea what evidence might be out there. They have to, if they find something that looks like white powder, they have to send it to a lab. They can't just conclude it's cocaine. So there's a lot of methodology in a police investigation, because remember, the purpose is to gather evidence that then is presented to a prosecutor who will decide if there should be charges or not. So that is what is, kind of the goal in a criminal investigation. Also in a criminal investigation, there isn't a real timeline or a time limit. There's, they obviously, a crime is committed at some point and someone reports it. There may be a delay in that reporting, or it might be right away. They may have responded to the scene. All different things can happen. It depends on what the crime is. If they're responding to a murder scene, they're gonna, immediately block off the whole area and keep everybody out to protect the integrity of the evidence. And as we talked about the other day, then the evidence tech comes and they take pictures and fingerprints and all that CSI stuff. Doesn't really work the way it does on CSI, but you got the idea. Then the other thing that can happen, let's say that someone just walks into the police station and they say, I was sexually assaulted 23 years ago. Well, that's going to be handled a lot differently than someone who walks into the emergency room and says, I was just sexually assaulted, because you would have spoliation of evidence. It's not there anymore. So those are some of the things that can distinguish the way that investigations look. When evidence is gathered, it has to be bag tagged and preserved, and there has to be a chain of custody from the minute it was collected until it appears in court, if that ever happens, to make sure that it was never compromised in any way along the way. So we talked about yesterday, when we're talking about a child witness or a child's memory, it's very, very, very difficult to protect the integrity of the evidence. And that is why those cases are difficult and and we have to have specialized knowledge to handle them. In a protective services investigation, we do have a time limit. If someone reports abuse or neglect it's based on suspicion, as we talked about yesterday, and then from there, within 24 hours, there must be a face-to-face between protective services and the children or child and the parents. Decisions can be made if to protect the child on an emergency basis. They can be removed from the home. If they are denied access by the family, they can go get a warrant and bring the police and insist on seeing the children. And so that's a kind of a snowball of what can happen if protective services comes to your door. If they do, they usually leave, if you don't answer, they leave a card. And at that point, depending on if you know why they're there or you don't know why they're there, you might do different things. So if you know why they're there, then you may have to consult an attorney before you make your next step, or you may want to just call them back. This is about child welfare. So they're going to come. They want to see your house. They want to see that there's beds. They want to see that there's clothes. They want to see there's a refrigerator. They want to see that there's food. They want to see that it's habitable, that it's clean, that your children have age appropriate stuff. If they're crawling, that there's a baby gate. Just things like that. You can limit when they talk to your children to, let's say that it's a sexual assault allegation. You can say to them, you can talk to my child about whatever you want except that. And understand that during a PS investigation, if they were in brick and mortar school, the PS worker could go to school, pull them out of class, talk to them without any other adult present, and you wouldn't even know about it. So there's no real reason to deny access because they're going to get it anyway. And you seem more cooperative with nothing to hide if you let them in your home for that reason. Sometimes they want to see your child to make sure that they don't have any bruises, if that's the allegation. And sometimes if your child does have bruises, they're going to say, like, what's that from? And, kids do bruise. It's part of being a kid, especially now when we're in our houses and like all of a sudden they're just running around outside and having a great time. And, things can happen. They fall off their skateboard. They fall on a stick or a log. Anything can happen anytime. So during that investigation, that's like the initial visit. Then the next thing that happens is that they may refer the child for a physical exam. And there are doctors who are trained to do sexual assault exams. And there are nurses that often do sexual assault exams. Or if it's just a physical exam, you may be able to go to your regular pediatrician if that's where there's a relationship, or just go to the ER. And so that is something that they may require you to do. They also may limit your access to your child. Let's say that one parent is an alleged perpetrator, the other parent is not. They may say, okay, alleged perpetrator parent, you move out temporarily during this investigation, and other parent, you stay home with the kids. Otherwise, I'm removing the kids from both of you. So if Protective Services does contact you, it's really important, just in case, that you've notified other family members or to see if anyone can take your kids if they need to be removed and they don't end up in foster care. Friends of the family are not considered placements upon removal unless they become foster parents, which does happen. There's policy that even relatives should become certified or qualified as foster parents if they're going to have children in their home. So that's a lot of what is going on during the investigation with protective services. They also might make referrals. They may say, okay, your house is a mess, so I'm going to give you, a week. And if your house is immaculately clean when I come back, then I'm going to be out of your life, or I'm going to just check on you for a few weeks, but nothing's going to happen. They may say, you need to go to treatment, you need to have random drug screens, and if you get it all together, then I'll continue to monitor you informally. So all of that can happen during the investigation. The other thing that can happen is when they interview children, and we talked about forensic interviewing a few days ago, and that is the only piece of a police investigation and a protective services investigation that really overlaps, is that they only interview the child once. Hopefully, they can do it more than once at the Child Advocacy Center, but ideally it would be one time, and that both investigations would use that interview. Protective services investigations do have a limit. They have to be completed within 30 days unless there is an override from a supervisor. Sometimes in sexual assault cases or cases where they're waiting for lab results to come back or a surgery to be completed, or whatever it might be, the supervisors can grant an override for another 30 days. Whereas I mentioned earlier, police investigations are timeless and they don't have a set period of time. They can continue to gather evidence for years. We hope that isn't what's happening more often than not, but that does happen. You also have situations where cases go cold. I'm sure many of you heard about the Detroit Crime Lab and how there were a bunch of boxes and boxes of rape kits that the DNA had never been processed or tested, that were found in a warehouse in Detroit, and some of those people were the alleged perpetrators were identified now by our DNA technology is in science is so much more sensitive now, and so much it can identify so much more with a lesser amount of DNA, that people are being identified now that couldn't be identified in the 90s when these kits were originally gathered. And there are prosecutions going on now for offenses that allegedly occurred 30 years ago. So that's an example of an investigation that where the case had gone cold, they couldn't identify the person, and now here years later they can. So that is another thing about investigations. If there's an investigation, whether it's protective services or police investigation, that involves an injury, unexplained injury, or unexplained bruising, or really any sort of physical defect. Those cases, or if there's a constellation of injuries, that can happen too, where you have, fractures and you have bleeding, and you have a broken leg and a broken finger and 4 broken ribs. Multiple unexplained injuries, things like that, then they're going to get a hospital involved in the investigation. There are designated people known as the Child Protection Team, which is a multidisciplinary team Most hospitals have them, and it involves a pediatrician who's an expert in child abuse. They don't necessarily have to be board certified in child abuse, but they are considered experts in child abuse. There is a social worker. There can be a nurse. There can be some, other individuals, and this team kind of looks at all the medical evidence and comes to a conclusion of whether it is child abuse or not. We've found in Michigan that that is usually a rush to judgment in a lot of cases, that they are not ruling out all of the possibilities if the fractures are due to genetics, and the baby has fragile bones, if there is an explanation for this fracture that's 3 weeks old, but they only interviewed the parents and said, how do you think your child got a fracture? Not, how did your child get a fracture 3 weeks ago? So we see a lot of different ways that those child abuse doctors are making the call. And I've done a series called Medical Kidnapping, and there's a blog and all kinds of information if that is something that you're curious about. But certainly there are more families than I want to name whose children have been removed for periods of time all over the country, because of kind of this rush to judgment medical kidnapping philosophy. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is investigations in family law cases. How does this investigation play into your custody case or your parenting time? Well, as soon as there's an allegation, technically, you could rush to court and try to protect your child, and change the parenting time. However, only one court can have jurisdiction over a child at a time. So if there's a child protection proceeding that has been filed by Protective Services in juvenile court, your custody case is on hold. That judge has no power over the children at that point in time. Sometimes it's the same judge if you're in a one court, one family jurisdiction. And if that's the case, the orders will happen in the child protection case. They will not happen in the divorce or custody case until the child protection proceeding has ended. So that's important to remember. You can't just rush into court on the other case to try to usurp what Protective Services is doing. Another way that investigations happen within a family law case is some attorneys work with private investigators. And we do in criminal cases and child protection cases as well, but it depends. We use these investigators to interview witnesses, to do background checks, to verify or validate facts or statements that were made to the police or Protective Services or other individuals. And it's really kind of we use them to turn the stones, as they say, so that no stone is left unturned, just to make sure that what they purport the evidence to be is what the evidence is. So we've pretty much talked about investigations, and with one more exception I wanted to talk about, or one more aspect I want to talk about, is during investigations, there will also be experts consulted. It might be that child abuse expert. It might be an arson investigator. It might be an accountant. It just depends on what kind of case it is. And in these cases, it's really important to use our common sense. And if in the investigation, someone has made a conclusion who isn't qualified to make that call, that's when our investigation has to come into play. For example, police officers often testify that in a sexual assault case, that it was, that the alleged perpetrator was building trust with the child, and that's how they created the opportunity, and that's how they were able to assault them. And the way that they built that trust was that they bought them things, they took them to places, they spent a lot of time, they gave them a lot of attention, whatever it may be. And that is called grooming. Well, police officers are not trained to recognize grooming, to explain grooming, to identify grooming, or to testify about the impact of grooming. That isn't their training. That is not something that they can be experts at. So that's another part of investigation that we need to watch, is who's being an expert and are they really an expert? And with that, I am going to say goodbye for today and let you know tomorrow we're going to talk about all kinds of expert witnesses and the role that they have in these kinds of cases, and how you pick them, how you decide if you need them, and go a little bit into detail about the admissibility of expert testimony and when we do it, when we don't do it. So I think that will be really interesting to you. And so with that, 5 reasons. Remember, protective services workers are essential. The police are essential. There's no more room in our jails. We're letting people out because of COVID-19. Kids being kids can get their parents in trouble. And number 5, very few people look good in horizontal stripes. So with that, be healthy, stay home, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.